Okay, I'll try to make this short and sweet. So really what it needs to come down to is we really need to start tracking these whales. I know people have brought it up plenty of times, but it's really frustrating that I think we can all get on that page, lobstermen, scientists, environmentalists. I think we just need real data, not educated guesses. We just put a rover on Mars. Why can't we tag a whale? I don't know why we haven't gotten to that point yet. Getting off that, I was curious to why we ended up with a October to January closure. That impacts, a rough guess would be 75 to 80% of our lobster season out in that area. Realistically, a spring closure would be a lot easier on us, and I would assume that whales migrating, coming and going, that would pose the same risk. I'm not really sure, but that would really help out the fishermen if there was a closure, if we could move it into the spring fishery, I believe. Also, I'd like to say that if ropeless was implemented, I don't believe there would be any change in whale deaths at all, because realistically, we're not a big enough threat. That's been said a lot of times, and I know scientists and environmentalists really don't want to believe that, and I don't know how to make them see that that's the truth, but it's hard for them in other states. Reading a report isn't really the same thing as being on the boat and seeing it with your own eyes. There just aren't right whales around in our area. I've fished in that closed area for 5 to 10 years. I've literally never seen a right whale. So lack of understanding shouldn't lead to policy making. It's just very frustrating from our end. But the other part is the whale population has increased in the last 20 years, if I'm not mistaken, and our fishery has stayed the same. So it doesn't seem to make sense that all the blame should fall onto us, or really any of the blame, actually. But thank you for allowing me to make a comment. Have a good night.
Let's get specific. The National Marine Fisheries Service's official numbers on the estimated size of the North Atlantic right whale population over the past 100 years are as follows. 1935, they say roughly 100. 45 years later, with a thriving New England lobster fishery that grew considerably during that time, although we don't have hard numbers to assert just how many more vertical lines were in the water in 1980 than in 1935, we know that there were many more. But let's just say that the number of vertical lines stayed the same during that period, which they didn't. The right whale population is estimated to have grown to 162 between 1935 and 1980. And keep in mind, this is before any regulations were implemented to make any of the lobster gear whale safe. Okay, from 1980 to 2010, anyone who's been fishing during those 30 years can tell you that the lobster fishery grew even more. Families continued to grow, young people continued to get into the fishery. A conservative estimate would be that the number of vertical lines in the water increased by 50% from 1980 to 2010. But let's be unfavorable to my premise and just assume that the number of vertical lines in the water stayed static between 1980 and 2010. And we know that it didn't. We know that it grew considerably. But even if we say for the sake of the argument that the vertical lines did not increase, the Fed's own estimate of the right whale population during that time more than doubled to well over 400 known right whales in the North Atlantic. Since 2010, the Feds have revised these numbers from the high 400s to the mid 300s. The current estimate is in the neighborhood of 350 right whales. And considering that there are thousands of other right whales in oceans all around the world, people have called into question how accurately a few federal employees flying around in airplanes can really authoritatively say exactly how many right whales are in the North Atlantic always, or can definitively say that they never go out of the range of where they're looking for them. This is one reason lobstermen keep saying, please tag the whales so we know how many there are and where they are. Which, if lobstermen were really killing right whales, would they be asking the government to tag and track them? But if we just take the Fed's estimates at face value as being 95% accurate, the big picture is we are being told that right whales could go extinct in the coming years because of a fishery that uses vertical end lines. The number of vertical end lines in the water increased exponentially since 1935, and the right whale population also increased, even with the documented unusual mortality events that have occurred since 2017. Think of it, this right whale population is still more than triple the size it was in 1935, when there were a lot less lines in the water. In that context, the narrative that these end lines are suddenly reducing the right whale population makes absolutely no sense. And National Marine Fisheries Service even admitted that from this big picture perspective, the 75-plus year record of the growth of the right whale population, along with the growth of New England's lobster fishery during that same time frame, quote, suggest that the population is capable of recovering at lower levels than the current estimate. Because it did recover from much lower levels with all sorts of lobstering going on. And this makes the extinction narrative even more preposterous. Because of how senseless this is, someone like David Abel needs to come up with increasingly bizarre, fictional explanations for why these lobster lines are just entangling these whales all of a sudden, when for at least 75 years they didn't stop the population from tripling in size.
For many years, particularly in the 1990s, before the rope strength of lobster lines became so strong that it became very difficult for right whales or other whales to break free of these entanglements. And then, of course, the ropes changed and more synthetic fibers were used and they became stronger, and we started to see far more whales dying from entanglement.
Actually, in the 90s, the lobstermen had already transitioned to synthetics long before. My dad, when he started fishing in the mid-80s, was using old hand-me-down rope from his dad, which was itself synthetic. Natural fiber ropes haven't been the standard in lobster fishing since the 1960s. So no, David, the strength of the rope guys in Maine are fishing with right now is the same as it was back in the 90s and long before that. So that's well over 30 years of universal use of synthetics in lobstering, and the right whale population was increasing during all of that time. But I do want to note this. The guys in Maine have been fishing for years now with weak links at the buoy that break at only 600 pounds of resistance. And what this does is ensure that if a whale got entangled at all, the rope would slide down to the buoy and then snap off at that point, freeing the whale. The lobster industry has not petitioned to remove their buoy breakaways. They're already in place and have been for years. But now the feds are suggesting that they remove that 600-pound breakaway after they replace it with a 1,700-pound weak link further down in the gear. This new rule that is being imposed makes it more likely that guys will just lose gear in the case of ordinary daily use on the new, longer trawls, but will actually make it less likely that whales could break free than if they just kept the existing 600-pound buoy breakaway rule. Why would the feds want to make it more likely that a right whale remains trapped in the gear in the unlikely event of entanglement? Seems to me like the fishermen are getting baited into making their gear more dangerous, which only makes sense if your goal is not to protect whales, but to orchestrate a situation where you can finally get the optics you need as ammunition to shut down the fishery. I mean, why else would you take away a measure with a proven track record of success, unless that measure works too well for what your real goal is?